Chapter 27, Fluid, Electrolyte, and Acid-Base Homeostasis. The first thing we want to look at are the fluid compartments. So, in adults, body fluids make up between 55 and 65% of the total body mass. The body fluids are in two compartments. Inside of cells, and that's known as the intracellular compartment. 2/3 of the fluids are inside of cells. And outside of cells, which comprise 1/3 of the fluids. So if we look at this diagram over here, we can see the female mass and also the male body mass. And we know that on average, males have more mass than females. We also see that males, in terms of solid percentages though, have a less percentage of solids than females do and are typically more hydrated at 60% of fluids versus females at 55% of fluids. Now these are averages, so it's not the case for every single male and female if we compare them to each other. But on average, females have more adipose tissue for reproductive reasons, and that adipose tissue typically dehydrates, which is another reason why as we get older and as we accumulate more adipose tissue, we also tend to be more dehydrated. So from that 60% of fluids or 55% of fluids, we want to look at the total body fluid. And again, we see that 2/3 of it is going to be intracellular, inside of cells. So you have hundreds of trillions of cells in your body. When we add up all that fluid within them, we call all of that the intracellular fluid or the intracellular compartment. And then 1/3 is going to be extracellular. Now, the extracellular compartment can be broken up into interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that is typically found outside of body cells within tissues. And secondly, we also consider blood plasma as kind of a separate thing, which this fluid is also outside of cells. It's outside of red blood cells and white blood cells, but we talk about it differently as this 20% in the blood plasma and 80% around every single other cell inside your body. Now, water is going to move between these major compartments, the intracellular and the extracellular compartment. So this will always be happening in order to achieve homeostasis. So you take a picture like this one, and you have fluid outside of the cell, known as the extracellular fluid. You have fluid inside of cells, known as intracellular fluid. And these levels will always be trying to balance each other out for homeostatic reasons. And so sometimes you'll lose fluid in the extracellular compartment. And when that happens, fluids are going to go from the intracellular compartment towards the extracellular compartment in order to keep the extracellular compartment well hydrated. And so in a sense, the intracellular fluid is a kind of reservoir of fluid in times of dehydration. However, when you rehydrate yourself and the extracellular fluid builds up, then that extracellular fluid, once it's in high enough levels, will return a lot of that fluid towards the intracellular compartment to store it again for another time when dehydration takes place. Now we have to remember that water moves via a process known as osmosis, and in general, this movement of water tends to go towards the higher solute concentration. And that's formed by these osmotic gradients. And so if you have more solutes on one side of a membrane versus another side, water will go towards the side with the higher solute concentration. And solutes include salts like sodium and chloride, or even amino acids or proteins. All of those can be considered solutes in a solution. So we can take an example here where we go and we drink a cup of water, and that water goes into the digestive tract. And that digestive tract is built for absorption, and that absorptive epithelium will grab that water and bring that water into the bloodstream. And of course, this is an extracellular compartment. Now, once it's inside the bloodstream, the blood volume levels will go up, and this water can then, via osmosis, can then move towards the tissues, but first it's going to be in the extracellular fluid around those tissues, and then eventually it will move into the cells, into the intracellular compartments. Now, during times of dehydration, when our blood levels drop, then we will do the opposite. We will extract the fluid from the intracellular compartment and bring it to the extracellular compartment, and eventually back into the bloodstream in order to bring our blood levels back up. We also, in this picture, are reminded of the Starling law at all capillary beds. In general, you have more filtration than reabsorption, and so you end up having edemas that develop. And these edemas need to be picked up by the lymphatic system, and the lymphatic system is going to drain that fluid, but also clean it up and eventually bring it back into circulation. The way to think about osmosis and movement of water from one compartment to the other is to talk about the tonicity of the compartments in relation to each other. So the term hypertonic means that you have more solutes in the solution. The term hypotonic means that you have fewer solutes in the solution. So imagine a situation where you drink a glass of water because you're dehydrated, and while you were dehydrated, water had already moved out of your intracellular compartment towards your blood in order to try to bring your blood volume levels back up to homeostatic levels. And while that water left that intracellular compartment, the solute levels went up within that intracellular fluid because water was lost, but the solutes didn't follow in as much of an amount. So now you imagine, going back to drinking that glass of water, that now all of a sudden a lot of water enters the bloodstream, and the water levels within the bloodstream go up, and these water levels going up are bringing your blood volume levels up as well. However, now that blood is going to be hypotonic compared to the intracellular compartment because it'll be more water per solute within that compartment compared to the intracellular compartment, which had become hypertonic because of dehydration. And so what's going to happen is that the water is going to move via osmosis from that hypotonic compartment towards the hypertonic compartment in order to equilibrate the concentration of these fluids. And remember that water always moves towards salt or towards the solutes. So if there are more solutes on one side of that membrane, water will tend to go towards them to dilute them. Now you imagine an opposite situation where you are sweating profusely because of a lot of exercise. So that sweat that comes out of your skin is the water that gets pulled from the bloodstream towards your sudoriferous sweat glands. And that water goes out of your body through the sweat gland. Now, there will be some salt as well within that sweat, but in general, you do lose a lot of water compared to solutes. And so now the water levels within the blood have dropped, making it a hypertonic solution now compared to the intracellular compartment. The intracellular compartment so far has not lost any fluids, but the blood has. And so now the intracellular compartment becomes hypotonic compared to the blood plasma compartment. And so what's going to happen is, again, water moves towards the higher concentration of solutes. And again, the intracellular fluid is your fluid reservoir. And so water is going to move via osmosis from the intracellular fluid towards the extracellular fluid in order to bring that blood volume level back up to homeostatic conditions. Now, we always want to achieve on a daily basis fluid balance. And that means that the daily gains and losses of these fluids are equal, typically on average about 2.5 liters per day. Now, the gains are going to be from two sources. You have preformed water, which is the water that you ingest with your food or your drink. So there is going to be water in food. For example, fruit is going to have a lot of water content inside of it. And then there's also metabolic water. So as you do your metabolism in your mitochondria, if you remember that aerobic respiration equation, you've got glucose, C6H12O6, plus oxygen, and this is inside the mitochondria, and it's for the purpose of making ATP. You end up getting CO2, but you also end up getting this water. And in order to remember this, what I like to remember is that C6H12O6 is a carbohydrate. And a carbohydrate, the word itself means a carbon, that's the C6, that is hydrated, which is the H12O6. So when we extract the electrons from that glucose in order to make the ATP, we end up generating this metabolic water. So water does accumulate through metabolism. So those are the two sources for water, either preformed water or the metabolic water. And you can see it here in this picture with the mitochondria as the metabolic water, the food and the water within the food, and then the drink. What about water loss? Well, with water loss, we have sensible water loss, which is the one that we can observe, and Most of that is going to be from the urine, and we can observe that happening. We also lose water in feces. And so we know that with diarrhea, for example, we would end up becoming dehydrated because of too much water loss. And then we also lose water via sweat. And these are the ones that we are obviously aware of. However, there's also an insensible water loss, which is usually unnoticed. And this is from expired breath. So every time that you talk, or you cough, or you sneeze, or just breathing, you're going to be losing water vapor through that breathing. So on a cold day, you can see it because of the difference in temperature. The hot air hitting the cold air shows you that water vapor. Now, the other thing is that we have cutaneous transpiration. So we don't need to sweat to lose water from the skin. From our skin, we will have basically some evaporation of water that takes place. This is the water that diffuses naturally through the epidermis and just evaporates all the time. A lot of this is going to vary depending on the environment. So if you're in the desert, for example, where it's very dry, then your skin is going to dry out much more easily. And so you would have a lot more cutaneous transpiration. If you're in a very humid climate, it would be less. And then, of course, activity. How much are you talking? How much are you moving about? All that stuff will affect your breathing and how much water loss you have from your breathing. And so again, on this side, we can see it's been broken down to us with these values. So feces, 200 milliliters on average, expired air, 300, cutaneous transpiration, 400 ml, sweat, 100, and then of course urine is going to be the one with the highest volume. We want to think about fluid compartments and how they work with each other to achieve fluid homeostasis. And so we know that the food that we consume is very high in salt. Most of us, on average, are ingesting a lot more salt per day than we need to. So we just think about a bag of potato chips, which are very tasty, and they have a lot of salt in them. There's a reason why we like the taste of salt. It's because salt in nature is actually difficult to find. And on the other hand, through industrialization and modernization, we've been able to get salt very easily and put it in our foods. And so because it tastes good, we end up salting our foods quite a bit. But in general, we're ingesting a lot more salt than we need to per day. So imagine a situation where you increase your intake of NaCl, or table salt, and now the plasma has a higher concentration of Na and Cl. And these are solutes. So that means that the plasma is going to all of a sudden become hypertonic compared to the intracellular compartment. So that means that you're going to have increased osmosis of water from the intracellular compartment, so from your cells, in other words, towards the interstitial fluid, and then eventually to the plasma. So water is going to flow towards the solutes. What is that going to mean for your blood volume? Well, if you have more salt in your blood and therefore now more water osmotically flows towards it, that means you'll have an increased blood volume level. And this is going to cause increase of pressure on your cardiovascular system. And so what we're going to see is an increased stretching of the atria of the heart. Now, we talked about this hormone in chapter 18. There's a hormone that gets secreted by the atria of the heart, and they work because of that high salt level. They're going to try to excrete that salt level. And this is called atrial natriuretic peptide, or sometimes we've seen it as ANP. And this atrial natriuretic peptide, and the word natria means salt, or sodium, I should say, Na. That's where you get that Na from, is from that Latin term natria. So that Na right there and this Na right here are actually the same Na. And what's going to happen is this ANP is going to go to the kidneys and tell the kidneys to reduce the reabsorption of NaCl. So, in other words, the opposite of aldosterone, which tells the kidneys to actively reabsorb NaCl and therefore water. But in this case, we are actually reducing that reabsorption of NaCl, and that means that NaCl will stay in the collecting ducts. And also that means that water will also go towards that NaCl inside the collecting ducts. And therefore, you should see an increase in excretion in the urine of not only NaCl, but also of water. And so eventually you'll see a decrease of blood volume in order to fix the problem of this higher blood volume level due to the increase of salt consumption. On the other hand, if we look at this fork now, we can see that the RAA pathway will get shut down. Typically, the RAA pathway, if you recall, is turned on during times of dehydration due to low blood volume levels. But in this case, we have high blood volume levels. So, because we have high blood volume levels, you'll see a decrease in the release of renin by the juxtaglomerular cells, and therefore a decreased formation of angiotensin II, and therefore a decreased production of aldosterone. And therefore aldosterone, since it's in low levels, will not be going to the kidneys to tell them to reabsorb the NaCl. And so basically, ANP is the hormone that is going to be driving this picture in order to achieve homeostasis, and not aldosterone. Aldosterone will be in low levels, ANP will be in high levels, because if you remember, these hormones are antagonists to each other. They're doing opposite things. Now, clinically, we always hear that if somebody has high blood pressure, they should not be ingesting a lot of salt. And this image tells you why, right? If you have high blood pressure and you have problems with your circulation because of it, and that high blood pressure, again, if you remember, the problem with high blood pressure is that it can damage your blood vessels. Then if you're ingesting too much salt, then you're always going to have this increased blood volume, which means your blood pressure will always be elevated throughout the day, which can be dangerous, right? This can cause blood vessels to get damaged. And so to keep that blood pressure low, right, we want to keep our sodium levels in our diet low, and that's going to keep our blood pressure low. continuing our conversation of fluid compartments and homeostasis, there is a situation where too much water can actually make you sick. And we call this water intoxication. And historically, when you think about Gatorade, this is where Gatorade comes into play and why it became a popular beverage, was because athletes, after sweating profusely because of their athletic events, if they would drink pure water without electrolytes inside of them, and electrolytes are basically salts, they're ions. So without the salts and without the sugars as well, what would happen is these athletes would get sick because of this water intoxication. So it's not really too much water. Really, what it is too much plain water after having lost a lot of fluid. And so we want to look at it up here as this excessive blood loss as a possibility, or sweating if we're thinking about athletes, vomiting, losing a lot of fluids from vomit or diarrhea. And this has to be coupled with an intake of plain water. So this is also why they have Pedialyte, for example, is when you're throwing up, or when you have diarrhea, they advise you to take, when you rehydrate yourself, to drink Pedialyte or to drink Gatorade instead of plain water. It's for the same reason. Now, if you're going to lose a lot of this fluid from either sweating or vomiting or diarrhea, then you imagine this fluid that you've lost has both water and the solutes inside of it. And you've lost water plus solutes. So now when you go to drink plain water, you're only bringing in the water part, but not the solutes part. And when you only bring in plain water, that means that you're going to see a decrease in, for example, sodium concentration inside the interstitial fluid and the plasma, right? Because you imagine that you've lost sodium as well as water, but now you're only bringing in water, which means a decreased sodium concentration. This means that you'll have a decreased osmolarity of the interstitial fluid. In other words, the interstitial fluid, the plasma, becomes hypotonic, right? You become hypotonic in your extracellular compartment. Now, the fluid from within the cells hasn't been changed yet, because let's say you vomit or you sweat a lot or you have diarrhea, the cells inside your body, that fluid hasn't been affected yet. But what's going to happen is that fluid, the intracellular fluid, is going to become hypertonic. So if I have a cell, right, this will become hypertonic compared to what is outside, which is the hypotonic extracellular compartment. And so what's going to happen is that what we're going to see is osmosis of water from the interstitial fluid or the extracellular compartment into the intracellular fluid, right? Because it's always going to go towards the solutes. Water will always go towards solutes. So it's going to go from this hypotonic compartment to this hypertonic compartment. And what's going to happen is the fluid levels will increase significantly inside these cells. And the cells will start to swell, right? They're going to get larger and larger as this keeps going. And what can happen is that these cells start to burst. And so the effect of this would be convulsions, coma, and even possibly death. So what we want to do is, if we do lose a lot of fluids because of sweating, vomiting, or diarrhea, or even excessive blood loss, we want to take in not plain water, but water that also has solutes within it. And so when you think about, for example, IVs, those IVs are not just plain water, right? They're going to have the solutes inside of that IV as well, because what you want is not the arrow just going in this one direction. What you want is a more equilibrium type of situation where you have fluid that can kind of go both ways, and so that you're not filling up these cells too much with water and causing them to swell and possibly burst. So let's talk about what we mean by electrolytes in body fluids. First of all, we should say that the word electro means electricity. And the reason why we call these electrolytes is because they are positively or negatively charged ions. And your nervous system and your muscular system uses these ions for action potentials, which are basically the body's electricity. And so that's where these words come from. So again, these are ions formed when the electrolytes dissociate and dissolve inside the fluid. And they're going to be controlling the osmosis of water between fluid compartments. They can also help maintain acid-base balance. They can carry that electrical current, and that's why they have that name. They can even serve as cofactors for health. So let's go through them one by one. The first one we're going to look at is potassium. Potassium is K+, and it's the most abundant cation. The term cation means positively charged. So K+, the plus sign means it's positively charged. And it's the most abundant cation in the intracellular fluid. And the second one we want to look at is sodium, which is the most abundant cation. Again, it's going to be Na+ in the extracellular fluid. And I like to talk about these two first because the way to remember this is that if you take a cell inside the body, and any cell inside the body is going to have this, what you're going to end up having is a sodium-potassium pump. And we saw this in the urinary system with how the tubules were able to reabsorb fluids and solutes. We saw that what this pump does is it pumps out 3 sodiums and it pumps in simultaneously 2 potassiums. So if you remember this, that you always have sodium in general getting pumped out, you can remember that that is the reason why sodium is the most abundant extracellular cation. And that because potassium gets pumped in, that is why potassium is the most abundant intracellular ion. So the next one we want to look at is chloride. And chloride is a negatively charged ion. So it's Cl-. So this is an anion. And it's typically extracellular. We saw it in the nervous system chapter when we wanted to hyperpolarize a neuron. We put chloride inside that neuron, for example, using the neurotransmitter GABA. And just as a reminder here, if you have a neuron inside the nervous system and its resting membrane potential is -70, and you don't want it to fire action potentials, you want to slow it down, what GABA can do is cause chloride from the outside, which is where it's mostly found, to go inside the cell bringing this resting membrane potential to minus 90, hyperpolarizing that cell, so that cell kind of stays quiet. So it's typically found outside, but it can be pushed inside as well. And we also, from the blood chapter, if you remember, we also had that chloride shift that we saw with RBCs, where RBCs, when they wanted to push the bicarb out, they also simultaneously, through a chloride shift, antiporter, as the bicarb went out, the chloride from the outside went into the cell in order to balance that charge, because we had the bicarb, which was negatively charged. Chloride is also negatively charged, so when you switch these, you don't see any change in the charge of that RBC. But again, that might help you remember that chloride is typically, and not always, but typically formed outside, or typically found, I should say, outside of cells. And also another famous place where we see chloride is in the production of acid inside the stomach using that H plus, that hydrogen ion, which is the acid, and with that Cl minus, and that is hydrochloric acid found inside the stomach. And again, that chloride gets pumped out, is found outside of cells there in order to help with digestion. So going back to this RBC then, this bicarb right here typically wants to get pumped out of those RBCs in order to become the blood plasma buffer. So typically HCO3 minus wants to be found outside of those RBCs inside the plasma. And that helps us to remember that bicarb is an important plasma ion. And when you see the word plasma, you know that's outside of cells. And it is found in the plasma because it forms as that plasma acid-base buffer system. In other words, that bicarb, when it's in the plasma, if there's an accumulation of H plus from metabolism, it will grab that H plus, bind to it, and push that famous reaction of carbonic anhydrase in that other direction, in the backwards direction. So continuing on here, we want to look at calcium, which is the most abundant ion in the body. And that makes sense because our bones, right, our skeleton has a lot of calcium inside of it, so that explains why it's so abundant. We use calcium in many ways in our physiology. We use it through blood clotting, and we saw that in the blood chapter. We use that in neurotransmitter release. We saw that in the muscle chapter and in the nervous system chapter. And we also saw that that calcium homeostasis was found in the bone chapter using that parathyroid hormone and using those osteoclasts and osteoblasts in order to maintain that blood calcium level at homeostatic levels. Continuing on, magnesium, which is Mg double plus, is an intracellular cation. And the way I remember that it's intracellular is because ATP is typically bound to magnesium. So adenosine triphosphate, if you remember those pictures of ATP, you usually see a negative charge on those P's, on those phosphates. And magnesium is important because magnesium has a double positive charge. And those double positive charges end up helping to neutralize that negative charge. And ATP, I know, when I think about it, or try to remember, right? Cells have to use ATP as their energy. So if ATP is found inside of cells, typically, then magnesium will also be found inside of cells. And magnesium is also important for enzymes that are doing our metabolism for us within cells. Now, phosphates are going to be important within cells as a buffer system that takes place within cells. And the way I remember this for the phosphate is that you have a lot of phosphate, for example, in ATP, in your nucleotides, right? That phosphate backbone in DNA and so forth. So if you want to try to find an easy way to remember where phosphate is located, you would find it inside of cells because a lot of the building blocks of life are going to be using phosphate. But we're going to see that it also serves as a very important buffer system in order to maintain the pH levels within cells at homeostatic levels. So this chart is giving us the values of these electrolytes, and it's using a graph to help us visualize it. Here in the key, we see that the red bar is going to be blood plasma. The blue bar is going to be interstitial fluid. And remember that both of these are going to be making up our extracellular compartment combined. And then the yellow is the intracellular compartment. And so, as we just mentioned, sodium is going to be the most abundant extracellular cation. So plasma is extracellular, interstitial fluid is extracellular, and you can see these values are very high. Intracellularly, you will have some sodium, it's just at very low levels compared to the extracellular levels. Potassium is reversed, and again, you can think of the sodium-potassium pump. Here we're pumping in all that potassium. So the intracellular compartment is going to have a lot of potassium. The extracellular compartments will have little. Calcium is found in high levels in the blood plasma compared to anywhere else. And that's, of course, because of that blood clotting, and also because of those calcium level homeostasis. We're always trying to maintain those levels within the blood plasma so that we can transport that calcium throughout the body. With magnesium, again, we think about magnesium being an important ion for metabolism and for ATP. So where would we find that? We would find that intracellularly. Chloride, we talked about the fact that it's typically found extracellularly. We can bring it in to a cell if we want to hyperpolarize a neuron, for example, we can bring it in. Or if we want to chloride shift the bicarbonate, we can use that as a mechanism to keep that charge neutral. Here is that bicarb, which is typically pushed out into the plasma or outside into the interstitial fluid. It's at lower levels within cells, but just realize that the reason why this is elevated here is because those RBCs are constantly doing what? That there's that carbonic anhydrase within RBCs, right? So RBCs are always going to be dealing with some of this, but they're going to try to pump it out as soon as they manufacture it. And then we said that the phosphates, which are composing a lot of those nucleotides and so forth, are going to be found intracellularly, and they're going to be serving as buffers intracellularly. And we also have here some that I did not talk about. For example, sulfur, found intracellularly, and also proteins in general. Well, you think about cells making protein, right? So proteins in general are usually going to be found in higher levels intracellularly inside of cells that are making them after all. But we also know that blood plasma has a lot of protein in it. So for example, albumin for the Starling law. We also have proteins like fibrinogen for blood clotting. We also have proteins like angiotensinogen for the RAA pathway. And so the blood plasma is kind of a special extracellular location regarding proteins and having a high level of proteins within that plasma. The next thing we want to do is look at blood pH homeostasis. And we want to see here that the pH of arterial blood ranges from 7.35 to 7.45. And just to remind us what this means regarding the pH scale is that 7 is in the middle, with water being 7. And the reason why this is the case is because water, if it splits into its components H plus and OH minus, well, it's the H plus that is the acid and the OH minus that is the base. And so because there are equal amounts of these two, water is neutral with a pH of 7. If we look at the lower numbers of the pH scale, we become more acidic as we move towards 0. And the reason why hydrochloric acid is very acidic with a very low pH is because it has that H plus in there. So it is not the Cl minus that makes it acidic, rather it is the H plus, which is simply just a component of water after all. If we look up at the pH scale with the higher numbers, we become more alkaline or more basic. So if we look at sodium hydroxide, the reason why it'll have a high number on the pH scale and be considered a base is because of that OH minus in there, which is that second component of the water molecule. And so if we have an equal amount of hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide, the H plus and the OH minus would neutralize each other and we'd get a pH back at neutral 7, just like water. So now knowing that, just realize how small of a window of pH fluctuations blood can have. So from 7.35 to 7.45 is a very small change. And if you are at 7.45 or above, you're considered alkaline. If you're 7.35 or below, you're considered acidic. So that means that your body is very fine-tuned to keep blood within this range before you start feeling sick. Now, there are several mechanisms to maintain that range. There's the buffer system, which we started talking about with the electrolytes. And if you remember, that bicarbonate is the plasma buffer, for example, and you've got the phosphate buffer system within cells. But also, we have to remember this equation of the carbonic anhydrase reaction, where CO2 plus water, and these are double-sided arrows, gives us carbonic acid, H2CO3, which splits, again, double-sided arrows, into H plus and bicarbonate, HCO3 minus. And so this equation goes in both ways. It has double-sided arrows. And if, for example, our H plus levels go up, then what we want to do, because we have so much H plus inside the body, what we want to do is bind it to the bicarb, and that's why the bicarb is a good plasma buffer, because if we bind it to the bicarb, we're going to move the reaction actually towards the left, forming carbonic acid, but then the carbonic acid will split into the CO2 and the H2O. Now, this CO2, we need to breathe it out in order to fix the problem, right? Because if it stays in there, if the CO2 levels don't decrease, if it just stays in there, then, right, the reaction will just go back the other way again and we'll form that acid again. So we need to exhale this carbon dioxide. We need to get it out. So if we exhale that CO2, then we've essentially fixed the problem of that high H+, and we can keep doing this. So the H+ levels could always just keep going up for whatever reason, maybe because of some sort of metabolism that's bringing us into acidosis. But our lungs can fix this by constantly trying to exhale, or sometimes we say blow off CO2. And what we'd see is a type of hyperventilation, right? A lot of active breathing in order to get rid of CO2 in order to fix this acidosis. So that's another way of doing it. And then, of course, we saw with the urinary system that we have special cells in those tubules that are very good at excreting H+, and also reabsorbing the bicarb, which would allow for us to neutralize any extra H+ that develops. Now, ask yourselves the question, why is the human body so good at neutralizing or getting rid of this H+? The reason is that in the default state, your body is an acid-making machine. So it tends to become acidic. So your foods tend to be acidic oftentimes when you think about eating protein, and that protein is just made up of amino acids, or eating fats, but after all, fats are made up of fatty acids. So foods can make you acidic. Also, the breakdown of those molecules is going to generate acid. And then metabolism inside the cell for energy is also going to tend towards acid, because when you do respiration, and for example, if you do anaerobic respiration, you know that you build up lactic acid in your muscles. And lactic acid is acidic, so that means your H+ levels would go up. Also, through metabolism, you can end up getting phosphoric acid from the metabolism of your nucleotides or other phosphate-containing molecules. And then we know that we've heard about the keto diet, for example, which is a type of diet that's high in protein and fats and low in sugars. And what happens is that when you're not metabolizing sugars, when your body breaks down those fats for energy, it tends to produce these acidic ketones, which we also, by the way, see in individuals who have diabetes, who are not able to metabolize sugars, and so they metabolize fats, so they build up these keto acids, and what we'll see is hyperventilation as a result of that. Another thing that we see, for example, is that we can lose our bicarb with fluid loss. So for example, diarrhea, when we lose that fluid, we've also lost a lot of bicarb in that process, which would end up making us acidic. So all of these things can make us acidic, and that's known as acidosis. So what we need to do is blow off CO2, but also the kidneys can help us by excreting H+. And going back to that urinary system chapter, whether you're in the proximal convoluted tubule or in the loop, or we also see that in those collecting ducts and distal convoluted tubule, You've got those intercalated cells that in default, what are they going to do? They're going to try to secrete H plus from the bloodstream into the tubule and get rid of it through the urine. And they will try to also reabsorb bicarb because all this H plus that's accumulating needs to be neutralized. So as you absorb the bicarb will try to neutralize that H plus. Now we should say that even though that is the default, you do have the ability to switch. If you're in an alkaline state, then those two arrows would switch. So during alkalosis, the H plus would get reabsorbed and the bicarb instead would get pushed into the tubules to get excreted. So that can also happen. Your kidneys do have the ability to do both. So let's quickly go through these buffers. So the first one we're going to look at is the protein buffer system. And because proteins are made up of amino acids, the word amino means nitrogen containing. And remember that amino acids have a central carbon with an R group that can be in 20 or so different ways. And then you've got this amino on one side, the hydrogen, and then the carboxyl on the other side. So the way that this works is that in alkaline conditions, if you're tending towards alkalosis, this hydroxyl can release that hydrogen right there and generate H+, which would tend to fix the alkaline condition. However, if you're in an acidic condition, what's good about this amino group is that it can either be NH2 or it can actually go to NH3+. How does it do that? If there's too much H+ in the surrounding, that H+ can hook up to that NH2, and now that charge, you can see it right there, is on that nitrogen because it's picked up that extra hydrogen. But in a sense, it's neutralized that H+. If the H+ is bound, it's no longer going to act as an acid. So amino acids basically have these two arms. You can think about them as the amino arm and the carboxyl arm. And in alkaline states, it'll be the carboxyl arm that fixes the problem. In acidic states, it'll be the amino arm that fixes the problem. Now, hemoglobin, we saw this in the blood chapter, is of course famous for transportation of oxygen, but it also transports CO2. And then we also saw with that chloride shift, and you may want to go back to that picture, that with the chloride shift picture, you also see that once you do the carbonic anhydrase reaction and you push the bicarb into the plasma, that H+ needs to be neutralized, and hemoglobin neutralizes it. So what we want to see here, and this is just a reminder that we're taking water and CO2 to make carbonic acid. The carbonic acid splits into the H+ and the bicarb. What we want to see is that this bicarb will get pushed out into the plasma through that chloride shift, but then this H+ needs to be neutralized, and what happens is the hemoglobin, it'll release the oxygen to the tissues that are doing respiration. And when it does so, it'll have better capacity to carry H+, and H+ will bind. And now what we have is a hemoglobin attached to a hydrogen ion. And so that hydrogen has now been neutralized. Now, when we go back the other way and we do the reverse chloride shift, the bicarb goes back into the cell, then that H+ will get released, bind back to the bicarb, and then the reaction will go back the other way in order to get our CO2, but then all we do is we blow off that CO2 by exhaling. So, of course, now we can talk about the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. And remember that this gets pushed out into the plasma via that chloride shift. So you can see that once it's inside the plasma, any H plus that accumulates, maybe from metabolism, from respiring cells, can be picked up by that bicarb to generate carbonic acid, and it's neutralized at H plus in the process. But also we know that this reaction can go both ways, and so this carbonic acid will also dissociate and give us our H plus and our bicarb as well. And the phosphate buffer system, which is that intracellular buffer system. And we're talking about this H2PO4 minus right here. If there is any OH minus, which would give us an alkaline state, that OH minus can end up grabbing one of those hydrogens from that H2PO4 minus. So one hydrogen would go towards it and give us water. And now all we've done here is, because we've lost that H plus, instead of a 1 minus, we have a 2 minus on that phosphate molecule. And this H right here would be an H1, even though it's not showing the 1 right there. When you only have an H and no number after it, it's just a 1 because it's lost that hydrogen to that water. But also, if we start with this over here, this HPO42 minus, if there is an accumulation of H plus, right, of course that H plus can go and re-give us that H2PO4 with that 1 minus charge on it. Let's look at disturbances to acid-base balance. So here are some causes. Severe vomiting or diarrhea. When you see these, you want to think, okay, there's a lot of fluid being lost. In the vomit, I would be losing a lot of acid because, after all, hydrochloric acid is being made by the stomach, and vomit is acidic. With diarrhea, I'd be losing a lot of bicarbonate. So if I lose a lot of acid, then I would be becoming alkaline. If I lose a lot of bicarb, I would be becoming acidic. With diabetes, we mentioned that if you cannot metabolize sugars, you're going to end up going towards fats, and this gives us those acidic ketones. And anything that affects breathing would affect your acid-base balance, because if you recall, your breathing is going to fix your acid-base problem. So if you're very acidic and you hyperventilate, you get rid of that CO2, that's going to help you fix that problem. So anything affecting the lungs, such as emphysema or pneumonia, or maybe a brainstem problem where your breathing is affected, can cause disturbances to your acid base. Remember those intercalated cells in the kidneys? So of course, renal failure, if the kidneys are not working properly, then that could cause acid-base disturbances. And high altitudes would affect your breathing rate, so that could cause disturbances. Now, let's remember these numbers. These are important to just memorize. Acidosis is anything below 735. Alkalosis is anything above 745. We also want to talk about the term compensation. Compensation is when your body tries to fix the problem. Now, there are two organs that can compensate. It's either going to be your lungs that compensate or your kidneys that compensate. So it's either going to be your breathing patterns, or it's going to be those intercalated cells. If it's the lungs with the breathing pattern that fixes your acid-base problem, we call it respiratory compensation. If it's the kidneys that fix it with those intercalated cells, we call it renal compensation. Now, sometimes these organs are not able to, for whatever reason, compensate. So we call that an uncompensated disturbance. If these organs are not able to fix the problem, then it's uncompensated. But hopefully, if everything is going well, you are compensating for these acid-base disturbances, which you're typically doing, right? Because these disturbances are always happening throughout the day, and you're always typically, under normal, healthy conditions, able to compensate for them and bring your body back to homeostatic levels. So let's look at some more specific disturbances to acid-base balance. Here we're looking at the respiratory induced acid-base disturbance. In other words, this is where the respiratory pattern is the one that is causing the acid-base disturbance. And so if your lungs are causing your acidosis, we call it respiratory acidosis. And this is going to be the most common one that you find. And this is due to impaired elimination of CO2 by the respiratory system. So if your respiratory system is not getting rid of the CO2, then CO2 levels will go up. And if CO2 levels go up, then that means that the equation will be going in this direction, and you'll be forming more carbonic acid. This is going to keep getting pushed in this direction, and you're going to be forming more H plus as a result. H plus levels go up if CO2 levels go up. So an accumulation of CO2 levels will cause an increase in H plus levels. Now, this could be from an injury to the respiratory system, either from trauma to the brainstem or an infection that takes place that doesn't allow your lungs to do what they need to do. It could be a disorder of the muscles or the nerves involved with breathing. Your airways could be obstructed. So if you have a hard time breathing because of a buildup of mucus, for example, then that would be an airway obstruction. It would cause CO2 levels to go up and H plus levels to go up as well. Decreased gas exchange, such as an emphysema, where the alveoli lose their ability to elastically recoil, and this ventilation that is supposed to take place doesn't take place as efficiently. So here, what we're saying is respiratory acidosis is that the lungs are causing the acidosis in the blood. The opposite would be respiratory alkalosis. And here is where you end up having a decrease of CO2. And if you have a decrease of CO2, if CO2 levels go down, then that means H plus levels go down. And if H plus levels go down, then you become alkaline. Now, what would cause the CO2 levels to go down? Well, hyperventilation. Ventilating too much, in other words, would cause you to blow off or get rid of CO2, and therefore the CO2 levels within your body would drop. So severe anxiety, we know, would cause hyperventilation. Your breathing pattern is not exactly regular during times of anxiety. That means you're blowing off more CO2. That means CO2 levels are dropping inside your body. That means H plus levels are dropping inside the body. That means you're becoming more alkaline. A condition in which you're not receiving enough oxygen, such as in high altitude, or congestive heart failure, or anemia, would cause you to breathe more rapidly because, after all, you're not getting enough oxygen. You're trying to get the oxygen. So you start hyperventilating. But in the process, you're also releasing too much CO2. And then aspirin overdose ends up stimulating the respiratory center to hyperventilate. So if you take too much aspirin, you'll find that your breathing rate increases. And this will release too much CO2, and therefore your H plus levels will drop, causing alkalosis. Now, when it's not the lungs that's causing this disturbance, we call it metabolic. So we have metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. So again, if the lungs are not causing it, we say it's metabolic. Now, this could be from a loss of bicarb or from a gain of H plus if we're talking about metabolic acidosis, right? So if you lose bicarb, which is your buffer, your plasma buffer, that would mean that you would become more acidic. If you gain H plus, you also become more acidic. So either one of those would make you more acidic. So let's see what could cause metabolic acidosis. So typically we think of metabolism here. And we've said that when you're doing a keto diet or when you have diabetes, you break down fats and you make those acidic ketones. That's metabolic acidosis because it's your metabolism rather than your lungs that are causing you to become acidic. What about when you do a lot of anaerobic respiration via exercise or fight or flight response? You would be building up a lot of lactic acid from anaerobic respiration. And again, this is via metabolism. And so because it's via metabolism, we call it metabolic acidosis. What about if your kidneys are not functioning well enough? Now, if your kidneys are not functioning properly due to renal dysfunction, those intercalated cells that on default are excreting H plus and reabsorbing bicarb are not working as well. So if you're not excreting H plus, you have a decreased acid elimination, which means more acid starts building up within your blood. And again, because your kidneys are involved and not your lungs, we call it metabolic acidosis. And then over here, what you see is an increased elimination of bicarb due to diarrhea. And so when that happens, your plasma buffer decreases, which means your H plus increases. And again, this would be an example of metabolic acidosis. So what about metabolic alkalosis? So this could be from too much loss of H plus or an increased amount of bicarb, right? What are some possible causes? Vomiting is most common. All that HCl, hydrochloric acid, that your stomach makes, you lose it through the vomit. What about diuretics? So diuretics is one of the more common ways of getting metabolic alkalosis from taking medication. Because when you are excreting all that fluid, you also end up losing a lot of the acids through the kidneys. And then a lot of antacids that we take in order to help us with our stomach, for example, those antacids will neutralize acids, which will give us an alkaline condition. So again, because none of these examples are being caused by the lungs, we call this metabolic, either acidosis or alkalosis. Let's look at some examples of some clinical views. And so here what we have is metabolic acidosis. And you can think of it either as lactic acidosis from exercise or from fight or flight, or you can think of it as ketoacidosis from, for example, being diabetic and not being able to metabolize sugars and instead metabolizing fats. So both of these are metabolic because the lungs are not causing them, right? So your cells that are doing respiration are causing the lactic acid to come out. The ketones are coming out from metabolism from fats. And so it's not due to your breathing rate that these two, either of them, are being caused. So it's definitely metabolic acidosis. So can the body compensate? Well, under normal conditions, it should. So renal compensation will be when the kidneys try to compensate. And here, we're going to use intercalated cells, which, again, if H plus levels are going up, we want to excrete the H plus, and we want to also reabsorb the buffer bicarbonate. Also, your lungs are going to try to compensate, and we call that respiratory compensation. In this case, because H plus levels are going up, the way to fix this with your breathing is to bring CO2 levels down. And the only way to do that is to hyperventilate. And so what we're going to see is that the respiratory rate increases due to H plus levels going up, and a lot of CO2 is expired in the process, and therefore we bring down the CO2 levels, and therefore also bring down the H plus levels. So under normal conditions, both the kidneys and the lungs will be trying to compensate, unless, for example, they cannot for some other reason. So if you have emphysema, but you're also having ketoacidosis, right? Well, then your lungs may not be able, they may be trying to compensate, but they may not be able to compensate as well as healthy lungs. Or if you have kidney failure and you have lactic acidosis, well, your kidneys may be trying to excrete H+, but if the kidney is not working properly, it's not going to be as effective at excreting that H+. So these organs will try to compensate in this condition, but they may not always be able to. Let's look at just a few more examples. So let's say you have respiratory acidosis. Well, if you have respiratory acidosis, ask yourself the question, can the lungs fix the problem? Well, if it's respiratory acidosis, then that means that the lungs are hypoventilating. And if they're hypoventilating, that means that they're not getting rid of enough CO2, which means CO2 levels rise, which means H plus levels rise. Now think about it, if it's respiratory acidosis, can you have respiratory compensation? Well, no, the lungs are causing the problem. They're not going to be able to fix the problem. So in this case, we definitely would hope and would need renal compensation to come in. So in some cases, if you think about the organ causing the problem, you won't be able to compensate with that organ because it is the one that's causing the problem. Likewise, respiratory alkalosis with renal compensation. Well, again, if you're having respiratory alkalosis, your lungs are causing the problem. If you're becoming alkaline, then that's probably from hyperventilation. And hyperventilation is going to be blowing off too much CO2, which means CO2 levels drop, which means H plus levels drop, which means you become alkaline. And so can the lungs fix the problem that they are causing? The answer is no. And so hopefully your kidneys will compensate by decreasing the secretion of H plus and decreasing the reabsorption of bicarb. Because remember, those intercalated cells can switch what they're doing and do the opposite of the default. So they can go and try to fix alkaline conditions as well as acidic conditions. Let's look at metabolic acidosis with respiratory compensation. Now, with metabolic acidosis, you have to look at what's causing that metabolic acidosis, because with respiratory, it's clearly the lungs, but with metabolic, it could be from several different causes. So that's going to tell you whether you can compensate with your kidneys or not. So, but in this case, we're talking about metabolic acidosis with respiratory compensation. And so, for example, maybe ketoacidosis or lactic acidosis. Those are both metabolic. Your respiratory system will try to compensate by increasing respiration. But would your kidneys be able to compensate as well? Well, sure, they're not the ones causing it. So they could be fixing either keto or lactic acidosis. But what if you had acidosis because of kidney failure? For example, imagine that the kidneys cannot excrete enough H plus because they're not working properly. Can the kidneys then compensate for what they're causing? And the answer is no. So at that point, the only thing that can try to compensate is going to be the lung, and that would only be respiratory compensation. The last example is going to be metabolic alkalosis with respiratory compensation. So here, for example, you want to think about vomiting and losing too much H plus. You become alkaline. And if you become alkaline, you're typically going to be hypoventilating after vomiting. Now, in this case, can the kidneys compensate as well, though? Well, sure they can, right? They're not the ones causing it. So you could also have that type of alkalosis with both respiratory and renal compensation.